All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome back to Know Who Drives Return with David Dropkin and my co-host, Joanna Macris. Today, we're delighted to be joined by Andy Behar, who's the CEO of As You Sow, the nation's leading nonprofit shareholder advocacy group. So we're going to touch on all things ESG, shareholder activism, everything that Andy is seeing in the space with in the space and his clients. So first off, Andy, really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us here today.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Awesome. So obviously you've been at the forefront of ESG and shareholder advocacy for multiple decades, but increasingly it's becoming more prevalent, maybe more mainstream. And particularly in this year, as we're seeing record number of shareholder resolutions that are focused sort of in the ESG space. Can you talk a bit to why now, and what are some of the driving factors behind this increased momentum in ESG from a shareholder advocacy perspective that we're seeing today?
So I actually don't know if I agree with that premise. I mean, I think that back in the 1970s, when the Jesuit priests showed up at General Motors and said, "Why are we investing in South Africa?" that this is not good for our company. This is risky behavior. I don't think things have really changed. I mean, shareholder advocacy has always been about stakeholders. It's looking at the employees as being critical to the businesses, to the supply chain, the community, and the customers. So it really defines stakeholder capitalism. Maybe the shift that's happening recently is a result of the January 2020, the World Economic Forum formally adopted what they called the fourth industrial age of business, which formally stated stakeholder capitalism, formally said the ideas of Milton Friedman that said abuse your employees, poison your customers, do anything you want to make as much money as possible, that had failed, that was very short term, and that the companies were no longer willing to abide by those ideas. So I think the idea, the philosophy that underpins shareholder advocacy has not changed since the early days. It continues today. It's just that the companies are now realizing, oh, actually, we want to be part of that philosophy because it's based on sustainability, it's based on justice, and that we're actually creating a regenerative economy that is, as opposed to an extractive economy, and that's where all these companies want to move.
To your comment about the Milton Friedman, view of the world, a lot of people say that for ESG investing to really take off, that the shareholders and activists need to demonstrate a proven business case for it, an impact to revenues, to profitability. I mean, what are your thoughts there? And what are some of the ways that activists can demonstrate the real business case impact of ESG?
I think there's been hundreds and hundreds of studies, academic studies, that have shown that better management teams produce better results, and that the number one cost of business is your employees. It's your staff. They are your greatest asset. And so creating a culture that retains and attracts the best and the brightest is always going to be a company that's going to be outperforming. A company that takes care of their customers and builds loyalty is going to be outperforming. So an example of customers, we had an engagement with Kellogg a few years ago. We were saying, why is it that we're spraying glyphosate, a known carcinogen, on all of our wheat, oats, and beans? Like, why are we poisoning our customers? We think that's not a great idea for business. And Kellogg, realizing that, there's all these lawsuits, there's a $200 million, a $400 million lawsuit on people who had gotten non-Hodgkin's lymphoma from exposure to glyphosate, said, maybe there's a point here. And they signed a pledge, and they actually got their entire supply chain to stop using these pesticides. And Kellogg's has been perceived now by customers as being safer to eat. And indeed they are. And what that's led to, they were the only ones doing it in 2018 when we were talking to them. When we just did another survey of these companies in 2021, fully of the 17 big ag companies, half of them now have a pesticide reduction policy. Well, why? It's because they're going to get more market share, which is going to lead to getting more investment, which is going to lead to outperformance. So these are decisions that are made at the board level, at executive level, and it's actually about increasing your market share and aligning your whole company in a holistic way. That's the companies that people want to invest in.
And
What? I'm sorry.
Go for it, John.
You see so many campaigns. I mean, thematically, kind of where are you seeing, the most interest and activity, if you had to kind of give a sense for the activity at a high level?
So by campaigns, do you mean like issue areas?
Yes.
So probably the number one is climate change. There's more resolutions filed on climate change now than ever. We started, As You Sow, started filing resolutions on climate change back in, well, I guess on fracking back in 2008, but then evolved into more climate in 2010. So those have been building and building, and also evolving. So back in 2013, we filed the first stranded asset resolution. It was based on the work by Mark Campanelli and a group called Carbon Tracker Institute. They did this work called the carbon bubble, and it looked at the balance sheets of the 200 largest oil and gas companies and said, if these were all extracted and burned today, we'd be at a 6-degree world. So 3/4 of them have to stay underground. Well, they'll never be commercialized. So as shareholders, we started asking, well, what are we going to do about this? And we want to understand the idea of climate finance was really born with that study. And then we turned it into resolution. So climate is number one, but now it's evolved to the point where we're now asking every company, every public company, to have a plan to reduce their emissions by 5% a year over the next 10 years. And the companies who are responding, they're saying, yeah, we have to do this. It's affecting our supply chain. It's affecting our customers. It's affecting our whole business. So climate, probably the most prevalent. The second one would be justice. And As You Sow has created a racial justice scorecard. We look at 57 key performance indicators of racial justice, diversity, equity, inclusion. So now we have a way of rating and ranking companies. We developed it after the George Floyd murder because we didn't know. There was no way to, there are no metrics. And so we brought together a team of experts and we worked for months and months to figure it out. So now we look at the Russell 1000 and we go to a company and we say, look, you scored a 5, your direct competitor scored a 35. Here's the 5 things they're doing that you're not. This is what it would cost you to become competitive. And this is the cost of doing nothing. Your brand is associated with systemic racism. You're not competitive. You're losing market share. So we make a business case for that. So really, companies are moving toward justice, toward diversity. We had 27 resolutions on that this year. 27 companies agreed that they needed to do this and are now on the path. The third, I would say, is political spending. Right now, we're seeing companies realizing that political spending is just too risky. Look what happened to Disney on Don't Say Gay. Look what happened to AT&T in Texas, Coca-Cola giving money to state legislators who were trying to essentially ban abortion. They had the heartbeat bill in Georgia. When we went down and talked to Coke, we went in and we said, we don't understand. Why is it we want to alienate 50% of our market? I mean, they're like, what? I said, yeah, why is it that we want, like, any woman who believes, or any person who believes in a woman's right to choose will never drink a Coke again because we have funded the people who are trying to abolish this. And it's just, they were like, we did? It's like, yes, you did. And they're like, how do you mean? And we showed them all of the state senators that they had supported. They didn't even realize it. They said, no, we want to teach the world to sing in perfect harmony. We want to give to both sides of the aisle. And we're like, it doesn't work that way. Your brand is now associated with a radical political statement, just like Disney, just like AT&T. So we believe that the best path forward is for all companies to withdraw all money from political spending, including the dark money and the trade association money. IBM has not given a political donation since 1964, and they get plenty of government grants. But by the way, just one thing I just want to clarify, just As You Sow is a 501c3, we're a nonprofit, so we don't have clients. We're working on issue areas So just to clarify, because I know the opening you asked about our clients, we do not have clients.
Oh, I misspoke on my part. So thanks for the clarification. But you are mentioning that, right? So, these issues are becoming, top of mind for maybe it used to be a subsector of companies, but now, as you mentioned, all public companies effectively. What are you seeing in terms of the boardroom of these companies, in terms of composition of maybe folks who have, ESG experience or expertise in some of the areas that you've mentioned? Are you seeing, a push to, change board composition or, mandate, an ESG strategy at the board level to help these companies sort of think through a lot of these issues?
So we see both increased diversity. I know we're up to, I think, close to 30% women on S&P 500 boards. We don't know the real data on other forms of diversity because there's no disclosure. Now, NASDAQ has started some disclosure with their, I think it's a form, is it 5605F? Maybe I got that wrong, 2605F, where they have these matrices that the companies are putting in their proxy statements about their racial, ethnic, sexual orientation, all the different protected classes about that. So we're going to start to have a little bit more of a window into this information. Resolutions that we've been filing on companies around diversity, equity, inclusion are actually about disclosure. There's not enough disclosure for us to even understand what's going on. And so we've been asking companies to disclose their recruitment, retention, and promotion rates cut by gender, race, and ethnicity so that we can actually start to see, for instance, you can't see if you look at an EEO1. And by the way, we're asking them to also disclose their EEO1s, but now that there's probably 115 EEO1s out, an EEO1 won't show you if there is a promotion gap for women. You simply can't see it. And that's a real problem that we know that based on McKinsey studies that men and women starting at the same entry level, you're going to have at a senior vice president level, you're going to have, I think it's like 82% men, and women are just not promoted, even if the pay were equal, and it's not. So we need information right now, and we're asking companies for disclosure. Now, this year, we think we've got enough after filing probably 50, 60 resolutions over the last 3 years, enough disclosure that we can actually start to see what is leadership, what does best practices look like on a sector by sector basis. And then we can start to see who are laggards, who are leaders. But that's always the evolution of these scorecards is at first you have to ask for data, disclosure, then you can start to actually see patterns. And then it helps the companies to actually say, oh, this is what we're trying to get to. It was interesting, like we met with some very large banks, look like they have nothing going on. And when you look under the hood, they said, look, this is all confidential, but we have 40 full-time people working on DEI in 4 regional centers, so we are culturally appropriate. We're starting recruiting and training at 11th grade. We set up these summer camps. We help the kids get their SATs, get into school. It's like, why don't you tell anybody? And like, because it's a competitive advantage. We don't want our competitors to know. And so right. I think that says a lot when it's something they're hiding from view because they know it's going to make them more successful. And so we said, well, look, you're going to have to tell because this is like best practices. In fact, this one company, they had a whole thing about neurological diversity. Like, I mean, recruiting people who had autism and making sure they had, it's like, wow, that's not even on like any list that we've seen. And they've yet thought it through. They actually were really incredibly aware and had done a lot of work on it. So I think there's stuff going on we don't know about, but we should know about it soon. And that ultimately telling your investors the truth is really important. And the new SEC rule that just came out 2 weeks ago, that's all it's about.
Mm-hmm.
It essentially,
the
climate disclosure rule, it essentially says, when you disclose material information, like greenhouse gas emissions, it should be in the same or similar format, or it should be as trusted as audited financials.
Yep.
Ask anybody, do you trust audited financials? They go, yeah, of course. And the reason for that is because they're verified, they're in the audit. It means if they're misstated, the company could get sued.
Yeah.
Do you trust ESG data? No. Why would I do that? The company, there's no rules. It's not audited. There's no verification. It's in a CSR report or it's in some other report. It's on the website. You can't even, it's not comparable.
No uniformity across any.
Right. So what the SEC said with this rule is, we believe that you should be basing your material decisions, whether you should invest or not, on accurate data. We want trust. That's what the SEC was formed to do. So I listened to people objecting to the rule, and I asked them, do you want to make investing decisions based on inaccurate or misleading data? They're like, of course not. I said, well, let the SEC do their job. That's all they're asking here. And I think this is a big moment where people are realizing, we actually do want to have truth. We want trust.
On the climate issue, you recently did your own study of company progress toward net zero emissions. And I was kind of shocked to see that Tesla, EV company, performed, I think, the worst of the group. So, it's not really an oxymoron. I'm wondering, why they underperformed, what they're doing wrong, and, how companies can do better.
So the work that we're doing on net zero, which you have to frame against time. So again, we're asking companies to reduce emissions by 5% a year over the next 10 years. So 50% reduction in 10 years. And reporting to their investors on an annual basis so that there's actually, again, this trust element that this is what we're doing, this is how we're doing, this is our methodology. So there's a group called the CA 100 Plus. It's about $60 trillion of assets now. It's Series, the group Series created it, formed it, and BlackRock recently joined. But it's a group of investors that actually sees climate as being something that, as Larry Fink said, who's now a member of this, climate risk is investing risk, that it goes across your entire portfolio, particularly if you're indexed. And so it comes and so the CA 100 Plus, the Climate Action 100 Plus, they created a set of benchmarks. So we are saying that that's what you need to use, that this set of benchmarks that's been adopted by this 60 trillion of assets, that's what we want to see you use, and that's what this report used, those as well as science-based targets, as well as CDP numbers, and aggregated it into a format that people could understand. Like, how do you actually score these things? Because we go in and talk to companies, and we're engaged. We have about 100 engagements going on right now with companies. So they want to know, what exactly do we have to do? And one of the first things you need to do is to disclose accurately so that you can say, okay, what is 5% of what? What are we targeting, and how are we going to get there? So in terms of Tesla, they're just not real big on disclosure. They think they get a pass because they're making electric vehicles, and they do an incredible job. And they're taking huge numbers of internal combustion engine vehicles are being replaced because, frankly, they're just better cars. And Tesla's doing an amazing job also with their batteries, with their power walls. So Tesla's doing great stuff, but they're just not disclosing and not putting out a plan. I think that they could do it. I think that they probably would be the leader if they just decided, we're going to take this seriously, but they think they get a pass. It's kind of like Amazon. They have 100,000 electric vehicles, and they power their data centers with renewables. Yet every person who works at Amazon in their 401k plan has big oil, and they're burning down the Amazon. Like, literally, they own companies that are burning down the Amazon. And that contradiction, that they're doing one thing and saying one thing and promoting themselves as being climate heroes, and yet every employee that has a 401k plan, because I know most of the warehouse workers don't, is doing just the opposite. And so we did a lot of surveys of their employees, and we also did a lot of education of employees, and said, do you know what's in your plan? No idea. If you did have companies that were involved in Amazon destruction, how would you feel? Terrible. This is like whatever, 80% of their people.
Right.
So we brought all this stuff to management and we said, I think we need to do something here. The contradiction is just, the cognitive dissonance is like hurting our brains. And they said, no way are we doing anything. And we're like, really? It's such an easy fix, man. You guys could do it and take a victory lap. And oh my God, like we're like helping you here. And they were like, we're not changing a thing. So we're like, okay. So we escalated and filed a shareholder resolution. And they met with them again. They said, we're still not doing anything. And they immediately filed a no action, which means they asked the SEC to block the resolution from even being discussed or being on the ballot. So we filed our brief and we're waiting for the SEC to decide if we get to have a vote. Same thing happened at Comcast. Comcast also, they have a Vanguard target date fund. It's just chock full of fossil fuels. And so it's interesting. And you look at across the whole S&P 500, we have a site called Invest Your Values, investyourvalues.org. If you go there, you can look up and look inside and do a very deep dive at right now there's 16 companies. We will be doing the whole S&P 500, but you can look at the target date fund, which is the default option that most people are in. You can see exactly how many dollars are being invested in fossil fuels, in deforestation. And we update it once a month. This is actual accurate data. But also these target date funds are funds of funds. So within a target date fund, you got like 12 funds. So we broke down all the companies within every fund within the fund, aggregated them up. It's a lot of work, but it's really important for people to understand that they are complicit in their own destruction and they have no idea. They just are completely blind to it. Same thing with pension funds. There's $10 trillion in 401k and 403b plans. And so we want everybody to know and to invest with intention. There's another 27 trillion in pension funds in the US. And then there's all of Europe. No one has a clue what they're invested in, but it's like the whole species doesn't have a clue. They work hard. Everyone works hard. Here's 5% of my money for my retirement. They give it to a fiduciary and the fiduciary invests it, but they won't tell them where it's invested. It's like, don't look behind the curtain. Trust me. It's like, but wait a minute, you're investing in destroying the planet that I want to retire in. And they're like, no, we're not, and they wave their arms. It's the craziest situation I've ever seen. So we're just working really hard to shine a bright light on it and to get people to ask the question and to invest with intention. That's the important thing.
Do you think we'll see more of a movement toward tying executive compensation to specifically reducing emissions? Like, why aren't we seeing more of that? How can that happen?
So we are actually working on this very issue. Well, first off, for 8 years, we have been publishing a report called the 100 Most Overpaid CEOs of the S&P 500. A woman named Rosanna Landis Weaver is amazing. She's been writing this for us, and she's blogs. Every time a proxy statement comes out, she analyzes the comp package and blogs about it because they're very, very convoluted. But so she's amazing. So what we're doing is we're looking at the executive comp packages and how they're tied to emissions. Now, CDP might have a check mark and say, yes, it is tied. And the company might actually get a good grade for it. What we're finding is there's a lot of misleading information. So some people said, oh yeah, 17% of the bonus is tied to emissions. It wasn't the case. We went in, it's actually 17% of 3%. So you got to know how to read these things. And for the most part, we're finding that there is not a significant enough connection to actually make an executive change their day-to-day, change their trajectory, change their priorities. But we'll be coming out with a report looking at all the packages and how they're linked to emissions, because ultimately you have to incentivize change. Now, remember, the board of directors reports to us, the shareholders. So we have a responsibility. And if our board is not setting strategy and incentivizing our executives to execute the strategy, then we have an obligation actually to replace that board. And now that we have universal proxy, we're actually going to have the first time ever a democratic election for a board. No one's ever voted for their own boards. It's been this convoluted, blue ballot, red ballot, green ballot. Universal proxy, anyone who runs for the board, every shareholder will get to vote. It's remarkable that it's taken this long to actually have the most fundamental piece of democratic voting as part of capitalism, as part of corporate governance. So I think that's going to be a big shift.
It's always fun to read the proxy statements that are purposely confusing, and it's hard to. You're an expert. It's hard to get down to the nitty gritty. But so, do you think we're going to see in the near term, at least, a lot more shareholder pressure to tie CEO compensation and board compensation to specific ESG targets?
I think absolutely. It's shareholders want the company to reduce material risk.
Right.
The best way to reduce material risk is to look at environmental risk, climate change, toxins in the food system, ocean plastics, environmental risk. It's like your company has risk, social risk, like racial justice, diversity, equity, inclusion, like how you treat your workforce, your supply chain, and governance. That's ESG. It's like all ESG is risk. That's all. It's just, so if you're asking, are we going to have our investors caring about risk? Yeah, we always care about risk. If you call it ESG, it's the same thing.
In terms of CEO pay, I mean, obviously more and more shareholders are rejecting executive compensation packages. How do you look at what's fair? How do you define what's fair? And, what would you like to see in an ideal world? How should comp be structured?
Well, I think in Japan, a well-paid executive has a 20-to-1 ratio of their pay to the median worker. In the Navy, these are admirals. Okay, these are people who are really competent people. It's 8-to-1. That's as high as it gets. In the United States, in corporate America, there's some companies that are 2,000-to-1. You have to work for 2,000 years to make the same as your CEO does in one. So I think there's something a little bit out of balance here. And so, first of all, obviously the taxation system of the wealthy. I mean, back when the US was 20-to-1, there was whatever 80% tax on if you made over, I forget the exact number, but so you were not incentivized to have it. Now, of course, people got around it with, getting stock options and all kinds of, whenever there's a new policy, people figure out ways to get around it. The bottom line is just, and this is what our reports show, is if you remove the 10 most overpaid companies that overpay their CEOs the most from the S&P 500 and use that as an investing thesis, you outperform the market. And we have shown this every year for 8 years. The most overpaid CEOs are doing the worst job. That's just a data point. The idea that the company is so dependent on this one person is it's a problem. It's a problem that really needs to get solved. And what we find is that, companies like Vanguard, they just approve every CEO pay package. There's big asset owners that just approve them all. And, the question is, should they even be allowed to vote? I mean, if you're Vanguard and you're running somebody's 401k plan, really, you're going to vote against their CEO? So there's a conflict of interest that's fundamental there that really should be looked at. And but I think there should be some sort of a cap on it. On our voting, As You Sow has a voting platform called As You Vote. It's on the Broadridge proxy edge system. So we vote against any package that's more than 100-to-1, which means we vote against 367 of the S&P 500 because they exceed that number. That's where we feel it should be. So more than half of the CEOs are overpaid, and their pay packages should be rejected.
Also seeing an uptick in animal welfare campaigns. Carl Icahn comes to mind specifically with McDonald's and Kroger. It was interesting that the McDonald's response was essentially about profitability, that, gestational crates are a way to conserve margins. Wondering if you think we'll see more animal campaigns, or how you see that trend shaking out.
Yeah, I think that was really, I got to say, I was really impressed. Carl Icahn's daughter is a very big animal welfare activist, and Carl suggesting that Leslie Samuel-Rich from Green Century, put her up as a candidate for the board. Leslie's amazing. Leslie would be like fantastic on that board. She is so brilliant. And the fact that he's using his playbook, his techniques,
Right.
For environmental, social, and governance is, I think, really a great sign that, it's like, well, Engine One doing that at Exxon last year. So I think you're going to see a lot more of this, that this is actually a risk that a more traditional activist investor is going to be concerned about. I mean, I think McDonald's response to it is, not what their response should be. I think they actually need to deal with it. But I think it shines a light on it. I don't think that a lot of people who are eating this meat are aware of what goes on, of the torture of these animals, and just this. I think there's a lot more conversation around it. Do we actually need it? When, frankly, you could eat Beyond Meat, and I doubt anyone could tell the difference. Honestly, we're at a point now where, and I'm not necessarily advocating that Beyond Meat is the best for you nutritionally, but certainly McDonald's could stop this practice and not lose any market share.
Right. That'll be a fun one to watch. And so, just going back to an earlier topic, because we brought it up, you did mention that there obviously has been, an increase in at least gender diversity on corporate boards, but there still seems to be, a long way to go with, board refreshment for a lot of companies. How do you think how can we help move the needle and sort of improve diversity on a broad level, across the gamut?
Well, as shareholders, we can certainly vote against the nominating committees if the company does not have enough diversity. Again, we know the gender. We don't know, the other. One thing that we're looking at is self-identification, of asking board members to self-identify, so that as shareholders, we know that let's just say you have a person of color and a woman on a nominating committee, we'd rather not vote against them. Most of these policies, so ISS, SRI, Glass Lewis, ESG, all the SRI, if there's not 30% women on the board, they vote against the nominating committee. And there could be women on the nominating committee, and there could be people of color on the nominating committee. The general response that I get when I ask about that is the nominating committee is not doing their job. As You Vote is trying to make more nuanced decision there. And there's some technological hurdles about voting against the committee, but not the women. We'd also, if people would self-identify, we could also not vote against them as well. So I think we're at this place now where, with NASDAQ, again, having the disclosures, but again, they're not associated with a person, they're just aggregated.
Well, yeah. So with the self-identification, how would that work in practice? Would that be, in a company's proxy statement, or,
if it was in the company's, if it was in the company's proxy statement, then I believe it would be a data point that could be pulled into voting systems.
Right.
I don't know that for sure. So, well, I guess I've already quoted myself on it. We're looking at it. We're looking at how that technically would work. We're actually looking at how do we grab and pull in the data from the NASDAQ matrices, and which data points we can use and can make actionable. So that's all a process. It's an ever evolving process with how do you get more accurate on your voting. Particularly the structure of As You Vote, it's a rules-based engine. It's not what ISS does. They have, a huge staff that are meeting with companies. And now, how is ISS determining race, gender even? And well, I guess gender's in listed, but sexual orientation, I don't know. Hopefully they're not looking at photographs and saying, well, I think that is a person of color. They might identify as something else, or that person is in transition in terms of their. Anyway, these are all new issues that need to be wrestled with, and
Yeah, it has to be self-identification. Yeah, but you would think that at least at the company level, if a given board isn't diverse, that they would obviously be more reluctant to have that disclosure. So well, we watch it on our side, so hopefully we start to see more disclosure going forward. Hey, so just to wrap, Andy, what are the top 3 things, I guess, you think we're going to see over the next 18 to 24 months?
I think you're going to see a shift in power to shareholders. I think that people who own mutual funds and ETFs, commingled funds, are going to start to demand that their right to vote. They've abdicated their right, and now there's the technology to allow them to have that right back. So I think you're going to see BlackRock, Vanguard, all those realizing it's a liability and handing that back. So I think you're going to see a shift of power. I think you're going to see the rise of retail investors also. So you're also going to see people not happy, not knowing how they're invested. I think you're going to see a demand for transparency. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a whole movement toward intentional investing, shareholders actually owning their power and then expressing it to the boards. Mm-hmm. And I think universal proxy will be a part of that expression, because I think there'll be more board candidates being run, because the cost is so much less now. Yeah. You don't have to hire a whole, I mean, you still do have to do proxy solicitation, by the way. You do have to send out your ballot to 67%, but the cost is much, much less, and it will be on the ballot. So I think you're going to be seeing a lot more. I think it's going to be normalized that the board gets refreshed, like 15 to 20% of the board just gets turned over every single year. And you're going to have new ideas. You're going to have much more diversity of thought. I think it's all going to actually be really positive for these, for the boards. So anyway, that's, I would say that the message to boards of directors is do your job, like do real oversight, no more rubber stamping. I think we should abolish the whole idea of having a CEO being a board chair. I think we should abolish the idea of a CEO being on the board at all. How can you be on the board when you report to the board? It just doesn't, so I think those sort of things, we're going to see improvements in governance happening. And I think we're going to be seeing the emergence of what we call a regenerative economy based on justice and sustainability, companies choosing to do that for the benefit of all stakeholders. And I think we're going to see a lot of companies that say, you know what, we just want to remain in the extractive economy. You're going to see them winding down. They're not going to be able to attract talent. They're not going to be able to attract capital. And so I think you're going to see a real divergence happening.
Love it. Do your job. Perfect. Perfect way to wrap up. Hey, so Andy, again, thanks again for speaking to us. Super interesting, and obviously, very focused on ESG, and we'll be continuing to watch.
Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we have to do another session on, what is ESG? Just because, yeah, that's a whole other topic.
It's everything, right? It's everything.
Well, no, it's not actually. But there's a lot of misleading information out there right now.
Fair. Well, that's on episode 2.
Okay, great. Take care.
Thanks so much.